right, well, good morning, Epic Church. You guys are good today? Come on, you didn't lose an hour of sleep yet. It's not next Sunday yet, all right? I'm excited to be here today. I've had a lot of caffeine, so I'm ready to go. I hope you are as well. We are in week 5 of a 7-week series called One Another, which is it's been all about just healthy, God-honoring relationships. And so think about your relationships today. So far in this series, we've talked about being patient with one another. We've talked about being humble with one another. We talked about honoring one another. And we've said in this series that all of this is built on the foundation of loving one another with God's love. Now, here's kind of one of the things that I've been thinking about, one of the things that I've always observed about relationships. I think when it comes to godly, healthy, life-giving relationships, the principles really are simple, but they're not easy. So the principles that we've talked about in the series that lead to healthy relationships, they are simple, but they're not easy. I mean, think about it. Pride is a whole lot easier than humility. Dishonor is easier than honor. Impatience is a whole lot easier than patience. And so these principles, they may be simple, but they're not easy. Now, here's the good news. These principles do work. Like the relationship principles of Jesus, they work, but they are not always easy to live out. And I say all that because that's especially true with what we're going to talk about today. And if you look in your message notes, you see kind of the key passage for this series from 1 Corinthians chapter 13. And just as a reminder, the Apostle Paul, he's writing to a church in the city of Corinth, so modern-day Greece, and he's writing to them about just the love of God and what it looks like. And he's writing to them as Jesus followers, saying, hey, when you interact with other people, when you do relationships, this is the kind of love to live out. And he says this, love is patient, love is kind. It does not envy, it does not boast, it is not proud, it does not dishonor others. So we've covered each of those so far in this series. And then here's the phrase for today. I'm not going to read this entire passage. It is not self-seeking. Everybody say that with me. It is not self-seeking. Love is not self-seeking. Another translation says love does not demand its own way. It does not demand its own way. So my wife, Rebecca, and I, we've been married for almost 14 years, and I'm just incredibly grateful for that. I love Rebecca more than I ever have. I'm just thankful, even in this season, what God is doing in our marriage. But there is no such thing as a perfect marriage. Just like any relationship, it takes work. In fact, some studies show that in marriages, year 5 is the toughest year. Why is that? Well, that's often when the honeymoon season has kind of faded away, and maybe kids enter the picture, and some of the family pressure increases, some of the financial pressure tends to increase around that time. So not for all marriages, but studies show that year 5 can often be the toughest year. But for Rebecca and I, it was actually year 1. We were overachievers, all right? So year 1 was our toughest year. And one of the main reasons why is that it was really a struggle for us to learn how to communicate effectively with each other. And I take responsibility for this because I had this mindset coming into our marriage, and I kind of put this on Rebecca, especially in our first year. So here's the way I viewed things, that, hey, when there's a problem, just lay it out. Let's just talk about it. And then as you share the problem, I'll give you the solution, and everything in your world will be fixed as a result of it. Okay? And so Rebecca would share sometimes what was happening or what she was experiencing, and I would hear it. I wasn't listening. How many of you know that's a difference? There's a difference. So I was hearing. I only saw wives' hands up for that one. Okay, we'll work. So I was hearing what was being said, but honestly in my mind, I was just forming the solution. Just waiting for my opportunity to jump in. And I'd jump in at some point long before she was probably finished actually sharing. And so I'd hear it and I'd say, okay, well here's what I hear. So here's what I think we should do. Here's the solution. Go do that. Problem fixed. I'm going to play basketball. Good? As what I started noticing, it's not hard to tell, is that it wasn't fixing anything. Like the problems never went away, and Rebecca was frustrated, and I was frustrated because I didn't understand, because I felt like my way just made perfect sense. Like, no, if we just do this, like all problems will be solved. Why are we struggling with this? And so thankfully, there came a point when Rebecca just kind of made it clear to me, and she said this, and maybe not these exact words, but this is what I heard. Hey, I don't need you to fix anything. If I'm looking for the solution, like I will kindly ask you for that. But more than anything, like what I really need is for you to just hear what I'm saying, for you to just understand what I'm feeling, for you to I just want you to hear what I'm experiencing. And I'm telling you, at that moment, and I'm not saying I get it right 100% of the time now, but that was a game changer. What is all that? Not demanding my own way, not just making all of the solutions about me and what I think should happen and just automatically, well, here's what we should, not demanding my own way, not being self-seeking, but turning that and actually putting my focus on her. And here's what the good news is for today. It doesn't matter if you're married or whatever. Think about all of your relationships. If we can learn to choose selfless over self-seeking, it can be a game changer for us too. I believe that today, and that's what we're going to talk about, this whole thing of love is not self-seeking. It is not self-seeking. So you see this question in your notes. Let's start here. What does self-seeking lead to in relationships? Let's start there. What does self-seeking lead to in relationships? And to help us, I want to look at some words that a man named James wrote in the New Testament. Now, who is James? James was a leader in the early church. He was actually the half-brother of Jesus. And so he had this close-up look, just doing life with Jesus, at how Jesus related with other people. I've joked about this before, but I think it'd be really difficult to be Jesus' brother, because you can never blame anything on him. He was sinless, right? So I imagine their parents coming home, hey, who put a dent in the car or the donkey, whatever, like, James, fess up, we know it wasn't Jesus. Okay, so anyway, whatever. Just be tough to be his brother, I think. So James is writing to followers of Jesus, and hear me on this. It was obvious that these believers, they were having some relationship drama. They were having some conflict. Because he starts right here in verse 1, chapter 4 in James. He says, what causes fights and quarrels among you? In other words, hey, there's conflict. So what's the source of the conflict? James is like, let's get at this. Let's figure out what's going on in your relationships. He says this, because this might surprise you. He says, don't they come from your desires that battle within you? I imagine some of those early believers like, no, James, it's his fault. It's her fault. If they would only do this, if they'd only see my way, like that's really the problem. But he says, no, it's coming from something within you. He says, you desire, but you do not have, so you kill. Hopefully you haven't gone that far today. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so what happens? You quarrel and you fight. So it's something within. Notice James says here that sometimes, I'm not saying all the time, but sometimes the root cause of some of our relationship problems and some of the conflict we experience is actually a conflict within our own hearts. And we can blame and we can get mad at the other person for not doing what we feel like they should do, but sometimes, again, not all the time, it kind of starts with a conflict in our own hearts, a self-seeking attitude. And then it actually turns to God. He says, you do not have because you do not ask God. And when you ask him, you do not receive because you ask with the wrong, say it with me, the wrong motives. What's that wrong motive? That you may spend what you get on your pleasures. So based on those words, what does self-seeking and maybe that selfish spirit demanding our own way, what does all of it lead to? I think we could sum it up in one word, and if you're taking notes, you can write this down. Self-seeking in relationships always leads to conflict. Self-seeking, so making it all about my way, it always leads to conflict. Notice in that passage we just read that it started with a conflict within, and then it spread to a conflict with others, and it actually created a little bit of a conflict with God. James says it another way a little earlier in that letter, James 3:16. He says, for wherever there is jealousy and selfish ambition, there you will find disorder and evil of every kind. You'll find conflict. You'll find a peace being disrupted. And what's the cause of that? He says a jealousy and a selfish ambition. So self-seeking leads to conflict. But here's the good news for today. Being selfless leads to peace. Now, let me just be clear on this. I want to be sure we're all on the same page. Okay, to be selfless does not mean that we should allow ourselves to be walked all over. It doesn't mean that you just let other people just kind of trample over you. Being selfless does not mean that we don't have any real needs, that we actually need others to meet for us. Being selfless does not mean that being in like a one-way relationship where it's always about the other person is healthy either. Okay, that's not what being selfless means. But here's what I have observed, because just in doing what I do, like I've observed a lot of different relationships. Here's what I've observed. Behind every unhealthy relationship, there is a high focus on self. there's a high tendency to blame. But behind every healthy relationship, there is a shared spirit of selflessness. And it doesn't matter if it's a marriage or a group of friends or in a family, okay? Is this easy? Of course it's not easy. But behind every healthy relationship, there is a shared spirit of selflessness. Okay, awesome. Great, Mark. I get it. Like selfless. Okay, we know that. We're in church. We know we're not supposed to be selfish, demanding our own way. Okay, here's the problem. All of us have a bent toward demanding our own way. Every single one of us. We just have that bent within us to demand our own way, to be a little selfish, to be self-seeking. And we live in a culture that feeds this. Like, have it your way, right away. Not just at Burger King, right? Like, with everything. Like there's all the ads that tell you that you should be able to have what you want, when you want, how you want, right? Look out for number one. Like, hey, you deserve it. It's about self-promotion. It's about building your own brand. And listen, that's okay with different areas in life, but it does not work in relationships. It does not work in relationships. In our culture, there's a big focus on being the GOAT. Okay, Mark, what are you talking about with that? Maybe half the room knows what I'm talking about with GOAT. Greatest of all time, right? There's a high focus on that. Just to give you some examples, in the basketball world recently, there's been some discussion. Okay, who's the greatest of all times? Is it LeBron James or Michael Jordan? I drift toward Michael Jordan on that. How about football? As Buffalo people, we don't like to hear this, but Tom Brady is probably the greatest of all time. Just admit it today. We're doing some heart work in here today, all right? How about movies? We're in a movie theater right now. I know you have your own opinion for this, but a lot of different lists will list The Godfather as the greatest movie of all time. You don't have to agree with that. It's okay. You can be self-seeking with that little opinion right there. But many lists will have that, just the greatest of all time. Now, let's talk about that. The greatest of all time. What does that mean, in God's eyes? And let me first say this, just to bring clarity on this as well. To go after your goals, to go after your dreams, man, there is nothing wrong with that. To maximize the gifts that God has put in you, to have a desire to make an impact with your life, to leave a legacy, to just to run the race well, to get everything out of you that you have inside of you. I think that honors God. So as we talk about this today, this does not mean that, just the goals I have, aspirations I have, no, none of that matters. No. God has gifted you for those things. He's created you for those things. But here's what I hope we see. For those who are followers of Jesus, we cannot escape the fact that greatness in God's eyes is actually countercultural. So culture defines great as one way. Jesus defines great in another way. So he was with his disciples one time, and they were having some disciple drama, okay? There was some conflict. They were actually arguing who was the greatest disciple. We'll talk about this a little bit later. But Jesus responds to them as they're arguing about who's the greatest, and he says this, no. The greatest among you will be your, say it with me, servant. Will be your servant. Jesus is saying, hey, you want to be great in my eyes? You want to be great in my kingdom? Then choose selfless over self. It's the only way, Jesus says. So here's what I'd love for you to do, just as we kind of turn the corner, even on your notes, and literally turn the page on your notes. I'd love for you to think about your relationships today. So for some of you, it might be a marriage. For others, it might be a family. It might be interacting with your kids or interacting with your parents. Maybe you think of a group of friends at school or coworkers or a boss or maybe somebody else comes to mind. Maybe you think of people you know here, people in your group, people that you serve with. Just think about those relationships in your life. And what I want to do is, as we talk about how to choose selfless over self-seeking, I want to give you 3 phrases today. Three phrases that I pray stick in our hearts, stick in our mind. And for each phrase, I'm going to give you just an example from Scripture of somebody who actually became great, even in God's eyes, but it wasn't the normal way we think. Because they chose selfless, they were actually elevated to a certain status in even God's eyes, and we'll see that today. So, how do we choose selfless over self-seeking? I'm going to give you 3 phrases, and the first one, just write this down and trust me, is this: be a Dorcas. You heard me right. Go ahead and write it down, okay? Spell it right, not be a dork. Be a Dorcas, okay? Mark, what in the world are you talking about? Just trust me, write it in, okay? Turn to someone near you and tell them, be a Dorcas. Go ahead and do that. Just be a Dorcas. And don't leave, and let's read the verse right here, okay? Acts 9, verse 36. Here's what I'm talking about. It says, in Joppa there was a disciple named Tabitha. In Greek, her name is Dorcas. Everybody say Dorcas. Just fun to say, okay? She was always doing good and helping the poor. Now, that word Dorcas, sort of an unfortunate name right there, okay? So my father, his name is Rick Rouse, and he's always told me that when he was in school, like some of his friends, they used to call him Ricky Rouse. And they'd sing the Mickey Mouse song for it. So like R-I-C-K-E-Y-R-O-U-S-E. It's sort of an unfortunate name. And the same is true with Dorcas. So what's the deal? Because Dorcas is more fun than Tabitha, so I'm just going to keep rolling with that. Now, Dorcas is actually the first Greek female mentioned in the New Testament. Her name actually means gazelle. There's some scholars that think that she was a beautiful woman. I don't know how we would know that, but that's what the name means. Here's what we do know, is that she was always doing what? What does the text say? She was always doing good and helping the poor. Always. We see a little bit later in that chapter, in Acts chapter 9, that she made clothing and she would give it away to those who needed it. She was always serving widows, and her ministry was evidently so important that when she died, God actually used Peter to raise her from the dead, and this little revival broke out in her community. And think about it. She was great in God's eyes, and here we are 2,000-something years later talking about her. Her story is in the New Testament. But how did she become great? She was selfless. She was selfless in her relationships with other people. It's just who she was. And it led to a greatness in God's eyes. Everybody say, be a Dorcas again. Be a Dorcas. So what does this look like in our relationships? Let me give you some examples. Maybe you have a friend going through a difficult season in their life right now, and God would want to use you to be their source of comfort. And here's the truth. It'll require time. It'll require energy. It'll cause you to have to give up some things to be there for that person, but it'll make a difference. God can use you in that way. Maybe it's a coworker or someone at school who everybody else sees as a difficult person, and perhaps they are a difficult person, but maybe we will remember that behind every difficult person is a broken person, and maybe God would want to use us to see that person differently. I'm not saying it'll change that person or what it'll happen, but it'll change us. God would potentially use us in that situation. Come on, married couples here today. How can we serve one another? How can we be focused on the needs of the other and not demand our own way? One of my favorite quotes, Zig Ziglar, I've said it here before here at Epic. He said this: you'll get all you want in life if you first help enough other people get what they want in life. Be a Dorcas. That's the first phrase. The second one is this. Write this down if you're taking notes. How do we choose selfless over self-seeking? This phrase is to take a basket. Be a Dorcas. Take a basket. I'll explain what I mean as we go. In fact, for this one, take a basket, I want to use the example of a guy named David, whose life we see in the Old Testament. Now, David was known as a man after God's own heart. This is the same David who took down Goliath. He was a leader. He was a war hero. In fact, Scripture tells us that at one point he had so many victories, like even in battle, that women would be in the streets singing a song after him, about him. Like he was the GOAT. Good? We're good? Like he was the greatest of all time in his day. But it raises the question, why was he so great? So why did God promote him? Some might say it's because he had great ability. But I would say if you look at his early life, that it's clear that because he was faithful in the small things, God trusted him with bigger things. And so in this example that we'll see with take a basket, what is that about? Well, David was the son of a man named Jesse. He had other sons, and some of David's older brothers were in war, or at least preparing to fight. And we see this passage in 1 Samuel 17, verses 17 and 18. It says, one day Jesse said to David, take this basket. Would you underline that phrase right there? Take this basket of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread and carry them quickly to your brothers. And verse 18 says, see how your brothers are getting along, and bring back a report on how they are doing. Now, here's what you need to know about David. He had it in his heart to be used by God in a big, visible way. He had it in his heart to be a warrior, to even go into war, to get into the action like his brothers are doing here. But he was willing to first take a basket of food to them. An act of service that wasn't in the limelight, that wasn't going to receive praise. He wasn't going to get recognition for it. And I guarantee you he had to fight some things within him. Like, no, I'm ready to go out there and fight and take this food to them. Like somebody else can do that. But he was faithful in the little things. Wasn't worried about self-promotion. Just served. Just did it. And because he was faithful in the little things, God promoted him. God trusted him with more. In fact, it's right after that little story that we read just there that God used him to take down Goliath. Faithful in the little, faithful when he wasn't receiving praise or recognition, and God promoted him to a different place because of it. Take a basket. Let me ask you this question. Are we willing to serve even if it means not receiving the praise or the recognition from others? In fact, here's what I've noticed. Like in my closest relationships, I'll use my marriage as an example again, it's often the small acts of service. It's often the small things that make the biggest difference. So like with my wife, Rebecca, I don't have to buy a brand new car or just a luxurious vacation to show her I love her. Now, I bet you it wouldn't hurt, okay? But you know what I figured out? It's like cleaning the kitchen. It's just like engaging and asking how her day is going. It's prioritizing some things that she wants to do and some things that she's thought about over my own. It's the small things. It's the take the basket type opportunities. Doesn't seem like much, but it makes a difference. So what about you? What's a small thing that you could do for somebody close to you that would make a difference? God sees it. So be a Dorcas. Everybody say, be a Dorcas. Take a basket. Say, take a basket. Here's number 3. Number 3 is this. Carry a towel. How do we choose selfless over self-seeking? Be a Dorcas. Take a basket. Carry a towel. I think this phrase, this image, and we'll break this down here, is one of the most powerful pictures in all of the New Testament. So just kind of imagine this for a moment. The setting is Passover. It's a Thursday night, and Jesus and his disciples, they have kind of like a secret meeting in the upper room. And Jesus knows that in just a short time, he's going to be giving his life on a cross. He's going to be suffering in unimaginable ways. So let me say it this way. The very reason that Jesus came to this earth was about to come to pass. And he knows what's ahead of him. I know we can't fully do it, but try to put yourself in that scenario. That in just a little bit, you're going to be going to the cross and suffering all these things. It'd be great to have some support from those who are closest to you, wouldn't it? But unfortunately, the disciples are having an argument over, guess what? Who's the GOAT? Who's the greatest disciple of all time? Which one of us is the greatest? And I think you can almost imagine like the disciples giving their different reasons. I can imagine John jumping in and saying, you know what, it's probably me, fellas, just so you know, because I'm the one that Jesus loved. That's how John often referred to as himself, the disciple that Jesus loved. And I can imagine as he's sharing that Peter probably jumped in like a little bit ticked off and no, let me share why I'm the greatest disciple. You guys remember when we were on that boat and Jesus was walking toward us? Hey, who was the one that jumped out of the boat? None of you guys. Like, I jumped out of the boat. I had the faith to do that. And they probably piped in like, yeah, you took 3 steps and you sank those. So what? I got out of the boat. Like, that was me. And maybe others gave their reasons, and I just kind of imagine Jesus taking it all in. And he's sitting at the table, observing proud hearts and dirty feet. And here's what he does. You see it in John chapter 13, verses 4 and 5. It says, so he got up from the table, took off his robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. And then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he had around them. Now, maybe you're thinking, okay, what's with this feet washing business? What's the deal here? So if you have somebody come over your house, chances are that you don't offer to wash their feet, okay? Hopefully. I don't know. You can if you want to, but you probably don't. Instead, like in our culture, in our day, it's probably like, hey, can I take your coat? Or can I get you a drink? Something along those lines. It's just kind of a polite thing when a guest comes into your house. But in these days, people are trapped walking long distances and they're wearing sandals. And so their feet are getting dusty. And so when they would come into somebody's house, the polite thing was for the host to offer to have their guests' feet wash. But here's what often happened. It often wasn't the host who actually washed their feet. If there was a servant in the situation, it was often the servant who washed their feet. And so when Jesus bends down and starts to kind of get ready to do this feet washing thing, the disciples jump in and they're like, no, Jesus. You're not a servant. You're not about to wash our feet. You're not about to do this for us. We know who you are. Like, sorry we got into that whole discussion, but you're not about to wash our feet. But he picks up this towel. I mean, think about it. Here's Jesus, the Messiah, the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the chosen one, God in the flesh, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. Here he is, and he's willing to show others what greatness really is all about in his kingdom. In a different spot, Jesus would say, even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. You know what he's communicating? He's communicating to his disciples, hey guys, girls, if serving is beneath you, then greatness is beyond you. In my kingdom, if you're not willing to serve, if it is beneath you, then greatness in my kingdom, it's beyond you. It just won't happen for you. Carry a towel. Think about that in our relationships. How can we do this? I know for me, one of the things that first comes to mind with this point is just our dream team. All of you who serve in some way, shape, or form, like in this church, on what we call our dream team. And I think about it even today. Like we have people who are here and setting up just all of the different environments that are here. And people who serve in this theater in the worship team. And while this is happening, people are serving families and on the Epic Kids team and serving children and guest services team members and coffee and all of the things down there. Then even behind the scenes, people who help during the week to do some administration things and get programs together. Just everything. Here's what I love about it. Like everybody does their part. It's not about getting the praise and recognition from others. Everybody does their part. And when it comes together as something that makes a difference. It comes together as something that matters. One of our values with our dream team, we have 5 values, and one of them is servant leadership. And the way we say it is this, that we strive to lead like our leader, Jesus Christ. Servant leadership. Now, what does that have to do with our relationships? As I said earlier, as I've observed relationships, behind every unhealthy relationship, there is a high focus on self. There is a high focus on my way and demanding my way, and they're not doing what I think they should do. And again, I know I said it earlier, but say it again, being selfless does not mean that your needs don't matter. Like you have needs that you need others to meet. And that's why God put it in place to where, hey, when we all have this shared spirit of selflessness, when we all operate in that way, like your needs can be met, my needs can be met, and the result, healthy relationships. So let me go back to Philippians 2, verse 5, really the key passage for this series. It says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus. Everybody say, be a Dorcas. Be a Dorcas. Take a basket. Carry a towel. So this week, be a Dorcas, take a basket, carry a towel. Like imagine the difference it could make in our relationships if we just shifted our focus just a little bit. Would you pray with me this morning? And as we pray, let me encourage you to just, come on, let's just lock in with the Father today. Because I know it's kind of hit me today. It's hitting me in this moment that the kind of God that we serve. That Jesus would be willing to lay down his rights. He would be willing to lay down his demands. That he did not come and try to rule with an iron fist when he walked the earth. Instead, he carried a towel. And he modeled this. And he didn't just say it. He was willing to be arrested and tried and beaten and crucified. And Jesus, today, by faith, we just say thank you. We don't take that for granted. And Father, were it not for your grace, we'd be in trouble. If it weren't for your grace, every single one of us, so Jesus, we thank you for modeling that for us today. I pray, God, that you'd put in our hearts, that you'd put in our minds, just even opportunities, the small kind of take the basket type opportunities that we can use to just serve other people. I know some of you are here today and like some of the tension, some of the frustration is that like you're willing to be selfless, you're willing to meet the needs of others, but maybe there's somebody in the relationship that just is like they're not there. And I get that. That's real. And God, I just pray for your peace. I pray for your strength for somebody who maybe is in that position today. So Jesus, thank you for leading the way for us. And I pray, God, that you just help us to carry out these things this week. To have relationships that honor you, to live lives that honor you. In Jesus' name. And everybody who agreed said,